Hills fam, we are starting right off the bat with a pop quiz. No, not really, because who likes a pop quiz? Nobody. I remember, I think it was either 7th or 8th grade, Mrs. Norris, math teacher, she would start every class with the quiz. So I guess it wasn't a pop quiz, we knew it was coming. But as soon as the bell rang, you had to be in your seat, pencil out, paper out, and she would go just through some multiplication, like 9 times 7. She'd pause 2 seconds, and then it's, 6 times 12, pause. And if you were 15 seconds late to starting, like to sitting down, getting your paper out, you missed the entire quiz, 0 for the day. You were, as the kids say today, you were cooked. You were cooked. But a certain way of making sure you were in the class on time, ready to go. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus gives his disciples a pop quiz. Up until this point, the disciples, they've been observing Jesus, watching Jesus. Now, there are other rabbis at this time who had their own disciples. And the disciple had to discern, is the rabbi just simply a rabbi, a good teacher? Is he something more than just a rabbi? Is the rabbi worth following? And so Jesus, he has his disciples, and they've been watching him. And in Luke 8, when Jesus calms a storm, the disciples, they're asking, who is this? Who is this guy? And we've had a number of miracles since then, the power and authority of Jesus at work. And now we come to Luke 9, and Jesus has just performed the miracle of the feeding of thousands, possibly 10,000 people, with just a few loaves of bread, a couple of fish. And Jesus is praying, and he decides to ask his disciples a question. So here's what he says in Luke chapter 9, verse 18. Once, when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowd say I am?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life." It's important to note that in Luke's gospel, anytime that there's revelation or some big decision, prayer is linked to it. So for example, in Luke chapter 3, Jesus is baptized and he's praying. It says that the heavens are opened. In Luke chapter 6, Jesus prays all night, and then he calls his disciples, like the 12. So he has lots of disciples, but after praying, he narrows it down to 12. And now in Luke 9, Jesus is praying again. And so when Jesus is praying and coming out of prayer, our ears should perk up, what's about to happen. And so coming out of prayer, Jesus asked his disciples this question. It's hey, who do the crowds say I am? What's the word on the street? What's the chatter? And the answer is one we've heard before. In fact, what the disciples say is almost verbatim what we've heard previously in this chapter by Herod. Herod he's ruling the area, and we read in verse 7 a couple weeks ago. It says, "And he," speaking of Herod, "was perplexed, because some were saying that John had been raised from the dead, others that Elijah had appeared, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago had come back to life." So the crowds, they're trying to figure out who Jesus is, and they realize that he is more than just a teacher. They've heard plenty of teachers. They've been to the seminar, they took the class, but there's something different about the way that Jesus teaches. We read earlier in the Gospel of Luke 4, it says, "They were amazed at his teaching because his words had authority." And then in Luke 7, with his miracles, it says they were all filled with awe and praised God and said, "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. God has come to help his people. The crowds have discerned that Jesus is more than a normal teacher. He's demonstrated power and authority in a way that no one else had. They'd never seen anything like it, and so they're trying to figure out, is this John the Baptist come back from the dead? Is this a great prophet? Is this Elijah? What you're thinking, how could this be Elijah? How could this be somebody else? Well, there was a prophet, his name was Elijah, who lived about 800 years before Jesus. And he was a powerful prophet. In fact, he was a miracle worker. He multiplied food. He commanded the elements. He brought drought and he brought rain. He even brought the dead back to life. And then there was this prophecy in Malachi, or Malachi was another prophet, about 400 years after Elijah. And here's what the Lord speaks through Malachi. He says, "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction." So people are wondering, man, is Jesus Elijah? And it's interesting because Elijah is one of the craziest stories in the Old Testament, is that Elijah does not die. As recorded, he is swept up to heaven in this chariot of fire, horses of fire, and what is one of the most, I wouldn't say unbelievable, but it's hard for us to imagine that this is happening. So Elijah never died, and there was this expectation that he was coming again. And so the crowds are wondering, who is Jesus? And I think people today are, I don't know if they're staying up at night wondering who is Jesus, but the crowds today, people today are still trying to figure out who is Jesus. Most people today, if you look at different surveys, believe that Jesus was a historical figure, that he did in fact exist. He was a real person, but after that, opinions vary widely. And so it could be interesting to look at surveys about what people are thinking of who Jesus is, but I don't think that question is as important as the next question that Jesus asked. They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life." "But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say I am?" Now we get to the heart of the matter. Who do you say that Jesus is? That is a question that we all must answer. It's not good enough that your grandma answered it. It's not good enough that your aunt has answered this question, or your parents have answered this question, but how have you answered this question? Who is Jesus? It is the most important question that you will ever answer. And at the Hills Church, we have people all along this journey. And so if you're not ready to give a strong answer yet, that's okay. You are still welcome at the Hills. But your answer to this question, it changes everything. And Peter speaks up for the group. "But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "God's Messiah." Jesus strictly warned them not to tell anyone. Peter and the disciples have finally got it figured out. It has taken them a while. They've been traveling with Jesus. They've been watching his miracles. But this was the first time that they declare their belief that Jesus is God's Messiah. Other translations, instead of God's Messiah, might say the Messiah of God or the Christ of God. And so they've come to recognize that Jesus is the Christ. I think for people today, when we hear Jesus Christ, we think of Christ being Jesus' last name. But it's not a last name. It is a descriptor of who Jesus is. It is a title. Jesus is the Christ. Christ simply means anointed one, or the Messiah. Now, the phrase anointed one, we find that in modern vernacular. You'll see it in the sports world sometime, like a young and upcoming prodigy in the sport. So this was said about LeBron James when he was coming into the league, being the anointed one or the chosen one, or President Barack Obama when he was elected in 2008, the anointed one, or Elon Musk in the tech world, or Beyonce, or sometimes called Beyonce Christ, as a designation of her being the anointed one. So it can take on a lot of different meanings. But for Jesus to be the anointed one, it's more than just a fun title or something to talk about. Like it has deep meaning. In the Old Testament, someone who was anointed with oil. Oil was placed on them, whether it was a priest, whether it was a king. David, when he was just a shepherd, was anointed with oil to be the king. So there's this idea of the anointed one that we see throughout the Psalms, we see it in the prophets, of this anointed one, this promised deliverer sent by God to deliver his people. He was going to be more than a teacher, more than just another agent of God, but the anointed, the Christ, the Messiah. And so Peter speaks up for the group. He says, Jesus, you are God's Messiah. And Jesus doesn't push back. Jesus isn't like, whoa, 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 hold on. So either that's the height of arrogance, or it's a sobering truth. I mean, can you imagine someone taking the title of Messiah upon themselves? Like if Jesus had a Instagram profile and different descriptors of who he was, like Jesus, storyteller, Jesus, miracle worker, Jesus, avid walker. But then the last one on there, Jesus, Messiah. Like either Jesus has a Messiah complex, or he is the Messiah. And then he makes a hard pivot. Like the disciples, they acknowledge Jesus' identity, and they are probably more excited that Jesus accepts that identity than someone who wins a $100 scratch off. Like they're having a good day because they're like, all right, we're with the Messiah, and he's with us, and we're part of the 12, and like, what's that going to mean for us? And glory, and we win. We win because we are with the Messiah. But Jesus, he's going to shift real quick. In verse 21, Jesus strictly warned them not to tell this to anyone. And he said, the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Then he said to them all, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? After hearing this, I don't think the disciples quite grasp what Jesus has just told them, because they'll have to tell them again and again what's coming. And they don't understand about the Messiah suffering. But I can just, if they did grasp what Jesus said, I bet they could be like, hey, Jesus, you could add vibe killer to your Insta profile, because you have just killed the vibe. His followers are going to follow in his footsteps. And for Jesus, being anointed means anointed to die. He says the Son of Man must suffer. It's not an optional feature. It's not an add-on to the program. And this throws the disciples for a loop. This is not their picture of the Messiah. I don't think this is what they realized they had signed up for. But it's there in the Old Testament, and they'll see it later. But many people in the first century, when you're speaking of Messiah, was speaking of glory and overthrowing the oppressive Rome. But Jesus, he looks back to Isaiah 52 and 53. We'll take a look at it just briefly, where it talks about the suffering servant who suffers, is rejected, who dies, and is raised to life. So just quickly, Isaiah 52:14. It says, just as there are many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. Like he suffers. It is necessary for the Christ to suffer. In chapter 53 of Isaiah, verse 3, it says, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hid their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Verse 8 and 9, it speaks of the suffering servant dying. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. That's not the end of the story. The suffering servant in Isaiah 53, verse 11 says, after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. He will see the light of life and be satisfied. A lot of Bible translations will break up what we read in Luke chapter 9, and we'll have a paragraph break and a header right before verse 21, which I think is unfortunate. Like sometimes those can be helpful, but I think it's better if we read that all together, because there's a link between understanding the identity of Jesus and our response to Jesus, or a link between the identity of Jesus and our call as disciples. So if Jesus is a good teacher, and most people think he is, a respected religious figurehead, then I can appreciate his teachings. I can even hold his teachings in high regard. But at the end of the day, they're just that, just teachings. I can cast them aside. But if he is the Messiah, if he is the anointed one, then his words for his followers carry greater weight. It's a sneaky setup. I think Jesus, he asked this question, like, who am I? Who do you say I am? And they say Messiah. He's like, you're right. And they're like, yeah. And then he's like, let me tell you what this means for you as my followers. Then Jesus said to all of them, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. These are not fun verses. Deny yourself. Deny yourself means to say no to yourself. And that is not, especially in our expressive, individualistic culture, not a popular idea to say no to yourself. But that when we come to faith to begin with, we repent. Repentance is in a way saying, God, I have been saying yes to myself. I've been saying yes to my own desires. And now I'm saying no. I'm repenting that so I can say yes to you. You are called to say no to yourself. So we need to ask ourselves, in what particular way am I being called to say no to myself? And denying ourselves doesn't mean we go around and sackcloth and shame, but it means letting go of everything that stands in opposition to God. It requires that your identity, your priorities, your attitudes and actions be reshaped and reformed. It's the relinquishment of all worldly values, possessions, and habits that stand in the way of obedience and faithfulness to Jesus. Not only are we called to deny ourselves, we are called to take up our cross once in a while. No, I wish it was once in a while. That would be a lot easier. But the text says that we are to take up our cross daily. Daily, that's crucial. Like, we don't get to take a break from cross bearing. There are no holidays. There is no take up your cross Sabbaths where we just stop. There's no sick days. Every morning we wake up, we must say, good morning, my cross. If you're married, I'd recommend not saying that in the direction of your spouse. That wouldn't work. Even if every spouse from time to time does have to take up their cross in the sense of putting the needs of the other, I better just move on. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian, pastor during World War II. He ended up being martyred, killed by the Nazis. In his book, The Cost of Discipleship, he says, when Christ bids a man to follow, he bids that man to come and die. When Christ bids a man to follow, he bids that man to come and die. What does that look like for us? To deny ourselves, to take up our cross daily? Like, this is not some vague spirituality where it's just something we have a discussion about. But this is like the meats and potatoes of our faith. What does it look like for us to deny ourselves? And it might be helpful, and we'll do this in our micro churches, just kind of have this conversation with one another, encourage one another in denying ourselves, taking up our cross. But I just wonder if it would be helpful to maybe just have some different spheres where it's possible to take up our cross daily. I think it's possible to do that in relationships, whether it's saying no to holding grudges or bitterness. It might look like offering forgiveness where it's been hard for you to do that. It might mean in a friendship or marriage where you don't try to win every argument. So this is real life. This is real life where we don't try to win. I like winning arguments. Taking up our cross, denying ourselves. Maybe it looks like sending a kind text. Maybe it looks like apologizing first. Maybe it looks like serving someone else's needs. taking up our cross. So we have relationships. Maybe it's in the area of habits and addictions. Maybe your life is consumed with binge watching shows and movies or doom scrolling at night, and your life is just consumed. And you need to begin to say no, and so that you can say yes to someplace else, to serving, to finding just a regular habit of doing something for other people. So habits and addictions. Maybe in the area of finances and possessions. Saying no to consumerism or hoarding wealth for your personal security. And maybe it's taking up your cross by beginning a regular practice of giving. The people of God for generations have practiced tithing, giving of, and we use this Christianese first fruits, but it's a biblical term. And so maybe it's beginning this practice of giving some way where you say no to yourselves so that you can say yes in generosity. Maybe it's not succumbing to the pressures of our culture, the societal norms when it comes to how we practice dating for those who are single and what that looks like. And the world has one way of dating, and as believers, like we live differently, saying no to our own desires. And this isn't about earning salvation, but a response to recognizing who Jesus is. That's where this goes back to. Like, if we get to the point where we say that Jesus is God's Messiah, then it would follow that when he gives us instructions in the book, when he tells his disciples what it looks like for his disciples to deny themselves, take up their cross daily. And it's not all like we're just not giving everything up, and living an aesthetic life, or because he offers us himself in return. Because that last part of that verse says, "Follow me." And we don't have time. I'm out of time to get into the rest of the verses there. But let me just point out, and we'll talk a little bit about it in microchurches, is that for Jesus, the crown followed the cross. The crown followed the cross. And as Jesus followers, it's the same for us. Like, the crown will follow the cross. On the other side of giving up, and the other side of denying ourselves, is a crown of glory that will last for all eternity. And friends, any amount of stuff that we give up in this life will be worth it. It will be worth it for all eternity. And so let's not have a temporary perspective on life. Let's open up our eyes to see an eternal perspective, and to walk and say no to ourselves for a moment, so that we can say yes to Jesus for all eternity. Grace and peace.